Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 153, and this is for our class for Tuesday, the 21st. So you can see in the notes below that I had indicated that our previous week has now been put in our past class sessions folder. So basically, what you can find is that you can access the entire course through the past class sessions folder. After a week has elapsed, I will retire it into that folder. But the current week will be available for you on our Moodle homepage. And our current week today happens to be about advertising and public relations and marketing, which I thought would be a good introduction to some of the media that we will be discussing over the course of the semester. And as you know, your first discussion forum question was to introduce yourself. So I wanted to introduce myself to you. And my story begins in New York City, which is where I was born and raised. And I attended college in upstate New York, the University of Rochester, to be exact. The school advertised itself as a place where students could experience, quote, real winters, unquote, and I thought that sounded quite romantic. And of course, it was brutal instead. But nevertheless, there I am, majoring in English, minoring in psychology, because I'm absolutely positively certain I'm going to law school after I graduate. So you never know how your career plans might change as you pursue your education. I took a Shakespeare class that basically changed everything, and I realized that really what I wanted to do was to focus on Shakespeare and his contemporaries. So instead of going to law school, what I ended up doing was going to graduate school. Albeit in a warm climate, I had had enough of those real winters. I settled on Southern California, UCLA to be exact. And no, they don't have winters. They have earthquakes, mudslides, lots of other challenges, but no earthquakes. So there I am, focusing on Shakespeare and his contemporaries, and I finish up and begin my teaching career, and I realized, well, I guess I missed winter after all. So I decided to go back to the East Coast. Anything on the East Coast, as far as I was concerned, would be a return home. And I applied to positions, and one position was open in a little community I had never heard of before, Greenfield, Massachusetts. So you know how this story will end. And then I went out for an interview, and we talked a little bit about what my transition might be like because I had been in California for so many years. But I was accustomed to winter. New York City does have winter, and certainly Rochester, New York has winter. And after all, I was assured that the winters here in Massachusetts, this is a quote, are not that bad, unquote. Now, I began in 1993. Hard to believe how much time has elapsed. 1993 is a historical year because it broke many of the winter records that had been set previously for snowfall, ice, and cold. It was a particularly brutal winter. No one was really prepared, but I certainly was not prepared. Nevertheless, I stayed, and I've been through all kinds of weather since. I mostly teach English classes, but I also teach, obviously, communications classes. So, yes, I am the one who teaches the horror film class in the spring. So, I have lots of eclectic interests. I also teach public speaking. So, that gives you a little bit of a background about me. And in terms of where we are, our first journal is not going to be due until Tuesday the 28th. And it's going to be about the internet, which is going to be the first media vehicle that we're discussing. So I see last class where we talked a bit about how scholarship could be utilized to study media and also popular culture. And this class, which is about advertising and public relations, serve as a kind of foundation to prepare us for the media vehicles that we will be discussing. So, my hope is that you had an opportunity to read the chapters that I had assigned. But as I am well aware, it's still early in the semester. You may not necessarily have had a chance to do so. There should be a copy of the book on reserve in the GCC library. Certainly, you can use older editions of the text. And these videos cover some of the major points about the text. So, Advertising, I wanted to begin with some definitions. This would be chapter 11, and the newest edition of the textbook is deliberately calling attention to a product or a service with intent to influence behavior. And basically, it's the way that media is generally funded. Advertising has undergone huge changes because of the internet, but we will talk about how the internet has changed basically everything. So we know that email now is mostly made up of spam. We know that data mining is one of the primary goals of the internet so that there can be advertising, specialized, targeted advertising towards an individual. We know we're inundated with video ads, with social media influencers, and so forth. I am old enough to remember when we talked about advertising in the early days of the internet and how when the internet first began, at least in the way that we think of it, it was thought that it would be advertising free, which sounds absolutely absurd considering the media environment we live in now. Just think about the way that something like Amazon has completely changed commerce. Think about how Facebook has completely changed data mining and also, of course, social media. We no longer have the kind of black brick and mortar stores that we need to depend on the way we used to. Um, Advertising is targeted, it's interactive. The industry, just to give you a little bit of a history, started really in the 1800s where products with name brands were basically promoted. Prior to that, things were pretty much generic and didn't have individual packaging. Some of those products have survived to today's time. Think about Campbell's soup, for instance. That's a great example. But honestly, advertising is as old as the town criers announcing products and services back in medieval times. Now, if you know anything about the advertising associated with Coca Cola, which is perhaps the most famous brand on the planet, it was basically made with cocaine. It was one of the unregulated patent medicines that was sold as medicine, but also as beverage or for some kind of consumption. It led to the formation of the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, that advertising needed to produce truthful claims about their product. Interestingly, as politicians have begun to use the elements of advertising, they are not held to the same standards as products are. If you know anything about Mad Men, which was a television series about the early days of advertising, ad agencies basically dominated. It was quite a lucrative career with slogans, visual design, and it was very much run by male Caucasians. And you could tell that in terms of the way that the advertising was produced with that particular bias. In the 1900s, though, many of the male ad executives would target their ads to females, the assumption that females had particular purchasing power when it came to household products. Something like Ivory Soap, for instance, which still exists. That was one of the many early products that were marketed by name brand, Quaker Oats, and a whole new science developed of market research to try to determine which demographic groups might be interested in which particular products. So advertising is quite explicit, but it can be implicit as well. So think about product placement in a film, that it's not necessarily promoting that product explicitly, but just the visual of the product is enough to influence behavior. In effect, advertising has become a kind of storyteller. All of these media vehicles have become storytellers. And as an English professor, I'm particularly interested in storytelling. And advertising does so through visual and audio means, as we see with many of the other media vehicles that we're going to be talking about, especially since the advent of the internet. Marketing is a specific branch that tries to anticipate, identify, and satisfy customer needs and customer wants. And maybe advertising is best expressed through Super Bowl ads, which is still one of the most watched programs on television, even though the heyday of TV is pretty much over. And many times individuals will watch the Super Bowl because of the ads, which can be works of art in many respects. In fact, they even have awards to give to a particularly clever advertising, the Clio Awards. And a 30-second ad can cost an extraordinary amount of money. Now, of course, we know artificial intelligence is also changing all of this as well. So it remains to be seen how artificial intelligence will be influencing the advertising world. But there are some regulations associated with ads. For instance, subliminal advertising has been banned. You're not supposed to basically try to promote a product that will appeal to someone's subconscious. However, I just said that product placement does so in a more obvious way. There is the association principle, and we see this in ads all the time, that we associate somebody who is perhaps successful with a particular product, let's say a car. The assumption might be that if we own that car, we too would be successful. Advertising has come under lots of criticism. Think about children's advertising to basically a demographic that is going to appeal to adults and to make the purchases, but children yet haven't formed the kind of critical thinking skills that we hope that adults have. Prescription drug ads, that's another area of advertising that's become particularly problematic. And I know that many of these drug ads don't even necessarily tell what they are selling. It's just a long list of symptoms that can be solved through the prescription drug, and then a very fast review of all of the possible side effects that the drug can provide. The idea of puffery or deception, again, ads can't deliberately lie, but they can perhaps stretch the truth a little bit. Think about things like most effective. That is very subjective as to how you could determine the most effective, let's say, cleaner. And there are different ways to appeal to different demographics. The plain folks pitch, and just an everyday person. So if you want to be like an everyday person, you would purchase that product. The snob appeal approach, as I was suggesting, if you're wanting to appeal to somebody who wants to be successful, then you're appealing to that demographic. Most advertising appeals to fear. Fear is very effective, but it also is very problematic because it interferes with reasoning. Just think about, the fear of social suicide, if you want to think of it that way. You've got to wear the right deodorant and wear the right beauty products. The bandwagon effect, whenever advertising talks about the number one product, the idea is that you want to join the bandwagon. You want to be like everybody else. You want to be part of the crowd. It's counterintuitive, but irritation advertising that annoys you, at the very least, will be memorable. And again, in the store, when you are looking at products, chances are you might reach out for that which is memorable. Storytelling and myth production, I think, is particularly interesting with advertising. What do ads tell us about our society? More on this in a few moments. Saturation advertising, just repetition over and over and over again, and the association principle, we oftentimes see this with celebrities, that a celebrity is linked to a product and we want to be associated with that celebrity. And public relations is really a branch of advertising. Instead of trying to sell a product, you're trying to sell a positive image, or you're trying to sell goodwill. And there are subtle and complex ways to influence public sentiment. There are whole careers that are devoted on this. P.T. Barnum, which you might know in terms of his circus, engaged in all kinds of outlandish efforts to secure newspaper coverage, things like staged events and hoaxes. The idea that all news about someone or something is positive in terms of promoting at least the conversation about that particular product or image. And publicity is just basically media images to spread information, hopefully not misinformation, about a person, a corporation, an issue, a policy. And much like politics, there are lobbyists, that try to influence lawmaker votes that are involved in advertising. And in the early days of the industry, in the 1900s, Ivy Lee was a major player. And the idea was that honesty and directness was the best public relations, which is still the case, I think. Um, Crowds don't reason necessarily, so they're influenced by symbols. So you need to be very careful about how you are influencing individuals. And a good example of this was in the 1980s, which is when I was a teenager. You may know of this particular story. It was about Tylenol, the pain reliever, where there was what was called by the media Tylenol scare, where there was an individual who was tampering with the product and putting in poisonous pills. Several people died. And what that led to was basically what we have become accustomed to, that there is that seal over the bottle that needs to be broken, and that seal ensures that a new bottle has not been tampered with. That was created by Tylenol because even though their public relations oftentimes recommended to them that the best course of action in the midst of this crisis would be to, in one way or another, reassure the public, even though they didn't have any reason to reassure the public. Tylenol did the exact opposite. They pulled the product from the shelves because they couldn't guarantee its safety. And many of their marketing experts indicated that that would be the ending of the Tylenol brand. It was the exact opposite, that Tylenol was able to get public trust by pulling its product, and they vowed they would not reintroduce its product until they could vow for its safety. And the way they did so was by introducing that safety seal, which other brands began copying afterwards, and has now become pretty much commonplace whenever you're buying any kind of medication over the counter. So the way that marketers can do this through press releases, so you try to create a story that sounds like news, but it's really not news. Video news releases, very similar. Um, Public service announcements, oftentimes companies, corporations, individuals will be involved in charitable events, and usually it's multifold, the reasons why. And one of the reasons why is to generate a positive image. You can also have pseudo events where it looks like that they are sponsoring an event, but really what they're doing is they're trying to sell their image or sell their product. Lobbying, as I had talked about before, to try to influence lawmakers or other individuals in places of power. That gets us into the issue of propaganda, trying to change public opinion. And oftentimes it's done by governments in order to gain public support for something that might be considered unpopular. War, for instance, which gets down to the entire question of ethics. And we certainly will be talking about ethics when we talk about artificial intelligence. But I wanted to direct you to a couple of documentaries about advertising. One is rather dated. It's from 2004, but I still recommend it. It's 55 minutes long, and you can see this in the third section of the notes below. Talking about how advertising and public relations is our environment. And I encourage you to watch it. You can see that I've included a link. I wanted you also to be aware of the Media Education Foundation, which focuses on studying media from an academic perspective. And they are located in Northampton, so basically they're neighbors, and I have included their website. And they've done some really excellent work about examining advertising and its influence on viewers, covert and overt. and they've done particular work with gender and advertising. You might have heard of Jean Kilbourne, who is known for her Killing Us Softly series, where basically in the 1970s she took ads and talked about how those ads portrayed women to try to reinforce a narrative about how women should be in society. And she updated that in the 80s, and she updated that in the 90s and in the 2000s to talk about how things were different but also the same. Others have done similar things. If you know Jackson Katz, he's very well known for his documentary called Tough Guys. Guise for guys, oppose, for instance. But of course, it's a play on the word guys, Guis. It's about how men are portrayed in advertising. And the GCC library has access to all of these. But in 2019, there was a panel discussion about Jean Kilbourne's work because it was so influential in terms of media studies. And this is an hour and 33 minutes, and I am going to ask you to watch this, so I'm going to end this video now. It's about female images and advertising and the work that she's done in Killing Us Softly. The panel discussion is called Killing Us Softly Then and Now. Again, it was filmed at Smith College, 2019, so it's becoming a bit dated. And you can see that the panel discussion is made up of lots of media scholars who talk a little bit about their perspectives about how to study media from an academic perspective, which I thought would be useful for you to see and hear because eventually you will be doing the same for your final project. Now, I certainly don't expect anything as developed or polished as what you are going to see now. Jean Kilbourne's work has taken place over decades and you have weeks, but I think it serves as a good role model of what one could do if one wanted to analyze media from an academic perspective. So it's twofold, my reasoning for watching this. The first, obviously, is because it will talk about advertising and public relations, which is our topic for today. But two, it will also give you some models about how you could go about analyzing advertising from an academic perspective, which is what we had talked about last class. So our attendance question today, which is due on our class discussion form by Thursday, the 23rd. And of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. And you're not required to respond to your peers, but you certainly are encouraged to respond to your peers. But you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. And the question is, how do you think advertising has changed since 2019's Killing Us Softly? Then and now, because time just disappears so quickly. What was contemporary in 2019 has obviously changed quite a bit as we're in the 2020s. Again, there's no right or wrong answer to this question. I just want you to watch the panel discussion and to think a little bit about your own experiences, your current experiences with advertising and public relations. So with that, I will leave you to watch the video. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.